I was hoping we hadn't laid off somebody or something, you know. Good evening, and thank you for being here. I know it's been a long day, and I want to say that as this Friday ends on the first week of the 10-day special session, I'm somewhat encouraged because the House of Representatives, of the $120 million that I was asking for to come on tops of the means of finance swaps and the funds bill that we need, of that 120 million, they acknowledged today by their actions that they would like to find 90 million of that, about 76% of the total that I asked for, which is good news because just a few days ago they weren't going to do any of that. It was going to be a cuts-only approach. The bad news is that a good part of what they put into the bill today was money that doesn't really exist, and that's the unfortunate part. But the good news is there's still plenty of rainy day money available to restore and make sure that we use real money that is actually in the bank. So I believe the legislature, particularly the House, is learning that it's not quite as easy as it might look or as the sound bites might indicate when you're trying to cut the budget and make these adjustments that total $304 million with only 4 months left in the fiscal session. You know, I've said all along that if the legislature, and that certainly means the House and the Senate, want to make deeper cuts than I propose, then they need to propose them and they need to vote on them. They took that first step today, and certainly they don't want to make the cuts that would have to be made without using $119 million in real funding, such as is available in the rainy day. I guess the most disappointing part of this is that a majority of the House decided to use attrition savings that do not exist. And I've told leaders in the House and the Senate all along that if there's real money there, I'm happy to use it. The simple fact of the matter is most of the attrition savings that we can generate out of the budget were included in previous deficit reduction efforts or in the plan that we had already submitted. And if the Commissioner of Administration is able to identify any more, we will certainly put those on the table. But what we know is, given the size of the overall problem, any real attrition savings will be minuscule and, for the most part, negligible. So that's why I believe that use of the Budget Stabilization Fund remains our best option. And unfortunately, because there were more cuts in the bill that came out of the House today than was necessary, a majority of the House decided to inflict more pain than is necessary, rather than using the full amount of the rainy days available for us, the $119.6 million, one-third of the current balance, for its intended purpose. And I'll say this again because it bears repeating. There has never been a more compelling or justified use of the rainy day fund than the use that I've proposed, and that is to fill this part of this $304 million shortfall. And it's never been contentious. It's never been a political thing. It's never been a partisan dispute. And it's unfortunate that it's gotten to that point now. But certainly that instrument will be at the Senate, and they will have an opportunity to improve it. That is the normal course of operations here in the legislature. And I look forward to working with the Senate as they do improve the bill that was passed today. I will tell you that my door's been open all week to members of both the House and the Senate. That's not going to stop. I will absolutely discuss and negotiate, compromise on a path forward, but I cannot compromise and accept a plan that relies on money that isn't there, that threatens our bond rating, or that fails to adequately fund critical priorities. Now, there's some other instruments out there, too. I'll tell you that I have deep concerns about the Speaker's House Concurrent Resolution number 1 that would basically cut statutory dedications in a way that you can't really know exactly what's going to be cut or by how much or whether it's even possible to administer in the fashion that the instrument is in right now. And it's rather gimmicky, and it would be yet another way for the legislature to say they voted on something that isn't real. And so I think there's a real problem with that. And the other part of it is not designed to solve any of our problem in the current mid-year. And for that reason, I think there's a strong argument to be made that it actually is outside of the call of the special session. So I hope that the House will take its time on Sunday and adequately scrutinize that instrument. And I would just remind everyone that the Senate soundly rejected that approach previously. And so I would hope that the Speaker would spend some time coordinating his actions with the Senate as well, so that we don't waste a lot of time and energy on something that can't possibly help us in this current fiscal year. Now, at this point in time, there's not a whole lot else to discuss, because that really is the one instrument that has been passed by the House that the Senate will receive. I guess maybe they already have received it this evening, and we'll take it up in the Senate Finance Committee tomorrow. So to sum it up, I'm somewhat encouraged because there's been tremendous movement. It's not as much as we should have, and part of the movement is fake, but it's something. And now the Senate has some work to do, and I look forward to working with them, and then having whatever they do, obviously get back together with the House in a final conference committee and make sure that we can solve this problem, and then focus our attention on the April regular session. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Governor, in terms of the negotiations with the House, the way it was presented, Chairman Henry and Jay had a little bit of an exchange, as I'm sure you know, in the Appropriations Committee hearing, where it was suggested that the folks who had been involved on the House side of it in negotiation sessions with you did not somehow represent the full House.
Yeah.
And who was there. Can you talk a little bit about why you don't think that the negotiation sessions were fruitful, and why you didn't think that they represented enough of the House membership?
Yeah, well, I don't think the negotiations were fruitful because they didn't produce an agreement. Part of that is that the House Republicans, I believe, wanted to do a bilateral negotiation with me that left out Democrats in the House, but also left out the entire Senate. And it didn't seem to me that that was an appropriate way to go forward, because at the end of the day, the Senate is a separate body in the legislature, and certainly it gets to weigh in on all of these decisions. And so that, I think that is the primary reason why they didn't bear fruit. But it did appear to us, in at least one instance, that a plan was advanced by Chairman Henry that had not been shown to the vast majority of the members of the House Republican caucus. And that plan, if I remember right, had a total of $50 million of rainy day or budget stabilization funds. And obviously the rest was very deep cuts. That's not a plan that he stuck with very long, but as we found out after the meeting concluded, not very many, if any at all, of the House Republican members had actually been apprised of that plan and given an opportunity to voice support or objection to it. And I think that may have been what the commissioner's referring to. He happens to be here, and so he can answer for himself if there's anything that he wants to add to that. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I would say a couple weeks ago, the House leadership was saying they didn't intend to support any use of the rainy day fund. Now they're up to $75 million. You are still where you were, I think, a couple weeks ago in terms of wanting to use $120 million. What do you say? And the House leadership is saying that they are not sure they even have the votes, the 70 votes, to get to the $75 million for the rainy day fund now in their proposal. So what do you say to people who are critical that you're not moving off your mark, so to
Well, I tried to address it a moment ago, and if I wasn't clear, I apologize. The Senate gets to work here too. And this is not a situation where I can enter into a bilateral negotiation with the House, come up with a number, and then the two of us triangulate against the Senate. That's just not the way that I operate. And so the Senate is going to take up the bills. They're going to go through the legislative process, and at the end of the day, there will be a negotiated resolution, I would assume. But it was too early in the process, and besides, it was sort of going in my direction. A couple weeks ago, they were going to use 0 rainy day. On Tuesday, wanted to use 50. Today, it's up to 76. So things are progressing nicely. We haven't gotten where we need to go, but because they did get up to 76 and expressed displeasure with the number of cuts that they would have to make to the point where they found this money that doesn't really exist, I think there is every reason to believe that the House wants to resolve a much bigger part of the problem than they had first let on. But we're going to see what the Senate will do now, and I suspect that there will be a negotiation when it's time. Yes, sir.
Just kind of jump off of that. If a figure less than 120 million is presented to you after Senate and House negotiations are completed, would you accept that?
Well, you want me to negotiate now? Anything else?
Well, I still have questions, and if you're not gonna answer that one, are you concerned, Cameron Henry has suggested that he's not sure everybody will reach a resolution in time for the end of session, and there does seem to be some question about whether or not they have 70 votes to pass a rainy day fund resolution out of the House right now. That seems to be what the leadership is saying. Are you concerned that this could melt down, that there could be some problem getting that legislation out?
Well, I guess there's some level of concern about anything that somebody says might possibly happen. But at the end of the day, I cannot imagine that the House of Representatives would allow this whole process to come crashing down and not do its job to fix this structural budget deficit that we are in, and that the manifestation of which is currently a $304 million mid-year deficit. Might it happen? It's certainly possible. I think it's unlikely because of just what the implications of that would be. And I have to imagine that there's far more than 2/3 of the House that takes their job seriously.
Have your lawyers looked at what happens if some resolution isn't reached in this session? Like what the next step is? Does it fall to you to make cuts? Does the legislature have to immediately come back? Kind of what's the process?
No, I don't believe the legislature has to immediately come back, and I don't believe that I have to, under the Constitution, make any additional cuts. If you look at the Constitution, it relates to what's the obligation that I have. Once JLCB gives me formal notice that there is a deficit, I have satisfied that obligation by calling the special session. Now, that is not to say that I wouldn't call us back into a second special session, but I wouldn't have to. And one of the options that I think we have, which is an unpalatable one that would certainly not be something that I would favor, would be coming back in and solving this during the regular session. In the absence of which, it would roll forward into next fiscal year and be declared debt, and sometime around next November or December, we will be paying that debt just like we paid the $313 million debt that rolled over from last year. And that too was avoidable. And that too was part of my discussions with the legislature last year before we adjourned, because I thought we should have addressed it then. Yes, ma'am.
Governor, I'm curious, this whole exercise and kind of how things have gone with the negotiations and now this, what you obviously believe to be non-existent money, how does that shade your view of heading into a regular session where you've been encouraging them to overhaul the budget?
Well, the budget in permanent structural tax reform, we have a huge workload ahead of us on a number of important things. I guess it's a little bit discouraging to see such a partisan approach by members of the House on an issue that has generated almost no controversy heretofore, and that is the rainy day fund. And you know, the idea that under the current circumstances, as I've set them out on Monday night when I talked to the joint session of the House and Senate, that we can't rapidly agree to use the rainy day fund that is available to us to help solve these problems, it does potentially portend that we have more difficulties ahead than I think we would all like to have. And certainly I hope that's not the case, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that that's not the case. Yes, ma'am.
What's the most troubling of the additional cuts that were in the plan that just passed? What do you find the most?
Well, you know, there are cuts to the Department of Health that I think are unnecessary and unwise. The Department of Corrections is in a position today where they actually need a supplemental appropriation, and the idea that we would cut them is particularly problematic for that agency. You know, but really there are problems across the board because much of the restoration of funding was done with money that isn't there. So even though the House spoke tonight and they said, we don't really want these cuts on higher education, we don't want these cuts on our partner hospitals, that's exactly what we're going to get if the Senate doesn't fix their problems and substitute real money for the imaginary money that the House sought to incorporate into the plan tonight.
One more question.
Thank you, Shauna. Well, maybe not even one more. Y'all have a good evening and a good weekend. It's just getting started. Thank y'all.